You're a master of both literary and Mandarin Chinese. You majored in Chinese as your bachelor's, master's, and PhD studies, and later taught Chinese at Stanford University. You started learning Chinese in 1970 when the US and China did not even establish diplomatic relations. What was your experience learning Chinese back then? And what do you think is the key to mastering this language?
It was a time when my attention had been focused on Asia already in high school because the U.S. was engaged in the Vietnam War, something that I opposed, and I was interested in learning about other cultures, and so that led me to study yoga and a little bit of Indian philosophy, and to begin studies of Chinese. At the time, it was a ticket to a very interesting and varied career that allowed me to engage with Chinese people of all sorts, ranging from peasant farmers and workers to presidents. The real key, once you've established a foundation in the language, is to go and live with the people who speak it every day. And I did that. I did first year at Minnesota, second year intensive summer program at Berkeley. Then I jumped on a plane and I went to Taiwan, and I lived with the family. And I spent a year there before returning home. And that was a great chance to really force your mind to adapt to a new way of thinking. But I think that's the ideal way to learn a language, and hopefully with not just older people, but contemporaries, young people like yourselves. As to classical Chinese, that's a long and never-ending process. And I mean, I was very fortunate to have had very good teachers. Using language as a way to open up doors to a different, what we say in Chinese, 境界, a different world in a sense. I've always been grateful for that opportunity. So when I was beginning to learn the language, I studied under a professor named Stephen Wang, who had been a student at Berkeley of Zhao Yuanren, Y.R. Zhao, perhaps the greatest Chinese linguist of the 20th century. He was involved in promoting what he called GR, 国语罗马字, which was a spelling system that was a type of pinyin that spelled the tone using letters. So, for example, the syllable ma was spelled M-A-A. Ma, second tone, was M-A-R. Ma was M-H-A, and ma was M-A-H. So I could read at the time, since I spent about 2 weeks learning that system, and they would drill us in the pronunciation. And then I could read a whole text written in GR Pinyin, and I could read it perfectly with the tones. I didn't have to look at these little marks. Little marks are really hard to remember, but if you can spell, then you'll know the tones. And for at least the first 3 years of my Chinese language learning, I was absolutely right about every tone for every word that I knew. I never made a mistake. I don't mean to boast about it, but because I could spell, I knew what the tone was. And I think that's an excellent system. Y.R. Zhao was very funny in the introduction to his book Mandarin Primer. He said some people swear at this system, some people swear by it, and I'm one that liked it very much. But I've had to learn other pinyin systems, including Bopomofo, which I learned in Taiwan. These are all just different tools. I think one of the things that I always found useful, but we used to memorize conversations. And so these would be sentences that people would normally use in conversation. They weren't texts, they were role-playing things. And so you would learn to speak just like a Chinese person would speak, using sentences that are spoken. The other thing I did was I studied Juban plays, because in modern Chinese plays they are also spoken, and it's a good way to learn how to speak. And lastly, for classical Chinese, it just takes a lot of it's long hours of study. I mean, I really there were no shortcuts for me. I did memorize some poetry. That was something that we did, memorizing poetry, other texts. That gave you it helped me get a feel for the language. But there's no substitute for hard work. I spent a lot of time in the library. I remember reading Hong Lo Meng, The Dream of the Red Chamber, when I was in Taiwan the second time I went. And my teacher was an elderly lady who had left. She had grown up in Beijing, and she's from a Manchu family. And this was in 1976. I'm guessing she was probably born around 1910 or 1915. Because a lot of the things in traditional Chinese culture that were in that book, she knew about, because she's seen it and touched it and felt it. And that helped make that book come alive for me.